Okay, just to sum up on the 6L6 power tube choices that you have, I want to give you a brief explanation of each of these tubes that are available. There are a total of 8 in our catalog currently. By the time you watch this, there may be 2 more because we're always developing new products and old products are going away. But just for what's on the program today in the year of our Lord 2004, towards the end of that year, what we have is 2 varieties of Russian tubes. We call them the R and the R2. That's the Sovtek and the Svetlana. Generally speaking, the stock tube that Fender uses and Marshall uses, and a lot of people have used this tube, it is a lower gain, slightly subpar 6L6. It has a little bit of a harsh distortion characteristic. However, the amplifier could be designed around that tube and be very nice sounding. You will watch it wake up if you plug in an R2, a C, an S. It will change the output sound of the amplifier. Usually a little bit more power will be received from the amplifier. Probably the highest power would be the American style 6L6, which is an exact duplicate of the original GE. By the way, the original GE that we make here in this factory, we're going to show you some of those processes. That's a very unique design compared to most of the tubes out there today, because it does put out the full power and all characteristics of that tube, and it has a very warm sound. And it was the tube that was used from Fender in their production from about 1955 till about 1977, 8, or 9, in that area where the actual companies producing these tubes went away. And they switched at that time to Sylvania for quite a while, maybe another 5, 6 years, and then eventually to the Russian tube. So most of power tubes and Fender amps made in the last 15 years have been this Russian, which really is a great opportunity to upgrade any of these other tubes. They'll pretty much all make your amp sound better, in my humble opinion. And of course, I have to preface everything I'm telling you, this is subjective. Some guys may like a Les Paul, other guys might like a Stratocaster. I'm a Strat guy. I have a Les Paul, but I'll find myself on that Stratocaster most of the time. That's just a subjective call. You guys know they're very different sounding, and I'm not trying to influence your judgment. I'm just trying to give you some parameters. But as you get away from these the stock Sovtek Russian tubes and you get into a Chinese or a Slovakian or a GE American-made tube here, or even our HPs that we make on the original design of the old Gold Line HPs, KT66, those will all kind of wake up that amplifier, put out a little bit more power, maybe a warmer distortion characteristic, not as hard and harsh as the original Russian. But these are all choices in power tubes for a Fender style amplifier, all interchangeable. And don't forget, you got that 1 to 10 rating scale, which we talked about in different segments. So all those are ways to help you choose. Probably our most popular tube is the 6L6 family. Second to that would be tubes that have copied, amps that have copied Marshall, as for the majority of their life used an EL34. In the original days, they used an M, a Mullard tube. Stay tuned, we're going to be working on one of those in the next months and year or so. We should have an EL34, much like we did the GE tube. We're going to have a Mullard tube version that we're producing. But for right now, let's talk about what's in the catalog, year of our Lord 2004, sometime in the year of August, in the month of August. We have some choices in these tubes here. That would be the EL34R. Again, we have an R2. Just like the Sovtek and Svetlana variations, we have a Sovtek and a Svetlana variation down here. We have an EL34 Chinese. That's another variation, so that's 3. We have a tube that we had a big hand in developing at the JJ factory, the Slovakian factory. We call that our our E34LS, and that's kind of sounds like a confusing number, but very traditionally in European nomenclature, and these of course are a European name. The American name for this, by the way, is 6CA7, much like your 6L6 could be known as a KT66 or an EL37. Your 6CA7 became known as an EL34 or vice versa. Don't ask me, I'm not sure who was first, but the American nomenclature, European nomenclature. The E34LS, they often would invert these numbers to indicate that this was a high power or a premium tube. We did something to the EL34S, which was a stock EL34 that was being made in the Slovakian factory, originally Tesla factory. And what we did is we took, I'm going to draw a little something for you right here. This is our plate material that comes over and encompasses the tube. As you recall from our conversation about how tubes work, you have a filament cathode, and you have a grid, and then you have a plate. Well, the plate is where the energy goes out to your output transformer and down to your speaker. And in the application of guitar amps, and with Marshall you're really talking about rock and roll guitar amplifiers, high gain, really being run at the max all the time, being pushed in that, it's a lot like a race engine. We decided we wanted to build a race tube. And so what we did is we found that when tubes got pushed really hard and they were running really hot, as guys often ran their Marshalls, we would get heating in the plate area here, and it would soften the material. You literally could see some red glowing in this area where the electrons are being funneled out to the output transformer. And we took a tip from transmitting tubes. These are tubes that actually we use in transmitting signal at broadcast hours for radio and television. Mostly when you listen to the radio, you're listening to a tube transmitting that signal. What they do in transmitting tubes is they put heat sink or fins on the tube to help radiate the heat, so that the tube, if it can exit the heat, it gets more power through. We took a tip from that and we added plate material to this tube. What we would do is we would take our stock tube and we would add some material to it here and here. We did this on this tube, and that kind of made it an E34L. By adding more material to the plate where all the action was, it cooled it more. It actually acts like a fin, an additional mass to the plate, so that when you're running it at the higher levels of its high power, it stays tight and clean. It doesn't get mushy. One of the things that guys hate is turning that amp up and having it get mushy. Well, with an E34LS, it has been our best-selling tube for many, many years. I guess it's been 12 to 15 years we've been building that tube, but that special heat sinks, which is different than any other tube on the market, and it does have that characteristic. If you're playing loud, it keeps a very tight bottom end, doesn't get mushy on you. Characteristic of the E34LS. Now recently we did much the same thing with the GE6L6. We were able to purchase not just the machines that made this tube, but the processing notes and everything, all the design formulas for them. So we've been building the GE6L6 for about a year and a half. We just this year introduced the GE6CA7. That was the USA equivalent of the EL34. Pardon me, let me put it down here. The 6CA7GE. GE really meaning the General Electric design. That is a USA, again, about 70% content USA. The S is Slovakian. The C is China. The R's are Russian. And so right now in our catalog you have 2 Russians, a Chinese, a Slovakian E34LS. We actually don't offer the tube made in the Serbian factory. The EL34 made there really have had problems with that over the years. That's not in our catalog. That is one exception, and the 6CA7. So for the average Marshall, if you want to stay in the EL34 family, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options. Now you can also go to the next level. An EL34 type amp is very similar to a higher power tube, which would be the 6550 KT88 family. This is a lot like putting a stronger link in the chain, and so you can run a 6550 or a KT88 in a Marshall 50 or 100 watt amp. In fact, for years, to increase reliability, Marshall even imported amps to the Americas with 6550s in them. But most guys didn't like that sound. It's a little harder, a little harsher. It's a higher power tube, but it doesn't actually put any more power out in this circuit because you haven't supplied it to put out more power. But in the KT88 family, we make a KT88. It's a groove tube specialty, and it's called an SV. Again, like our EL34S, it has these heat sinks on the plates, and it's a very clean sounding high power KT88. Probably aren't a lot of you out there that are going to be in this category. I'd say 95% of the, well, maybe 90% of the power tubes that we sell, certainly in dollars, are 6L6 or EL34 for the Fender style, the Marshall style amp. The only one we haven't really covered that's used in any popularity now would be one more. I'll try and squeeze that in this segment, and that is the little 9-pin EL84, which is used in Vox, in the copies of Vox like the Matchless, and actually many companies now make small Class A amps with this EL34 power tube. And it's obviously a smaller tube. It's in a 9-pin model, so it's just a tall 9-pin pentode. And in that family, we have a Chinese, which is indicated with a C, a Russian. The only company making them is the Sovtek. Believe the Chinese make them. And then we also have a Y, which is actually one of the more populars, and we have an S. So the Slovakian, the Yugoslavian, the Russian, the Chinese, 4 choices in the EL84 family. Now, to get into the specific characteristics of each of those tubes, I invite you to look on the website under those tubes, get one of the tube amp books where we go into a little bit more detail about the difference in sounds. Generally speaking, again, much like the 6L6S is a little higher power, tighter. We find that that's probably our most powerful EL84 we're using right now. Generally speaking, the harshness, the lower output of the Russian tube, very typical for the Russian tubes, also characteristic of an EL84, probably a sweeter sounding as the Chinese. Many people like the Yugoslavian tube. So these are really boiled down to choices that are subjective. You have to make your own decision. Depends on the amp you've got. One thing to know initially is if you buy an amplifier and you like the sound of it, but it's time to change the power tubes, find out what tube is in there. One of the reasons we were giving you these names like Sovtek and the Slovakian tubes are now called JJ, is that you can look in that amp and see, gee, that's a Chinese tube. Maybe I'll try a Russian tube. Maybe if it's a Russian tube, I'll try a Chinese tube. If you're looking to change things, if you're looking to improve it, but you like the basic sound, stay with that tube, but get it out of our catalog, because our catalog, the preamp tubes have been selected, the power tubes have been measured and matched in a meaningful way, and you can have essentially the same tonality of the amplifier with a great improved balance and performance out of the amplifier. That's really the purpose of Groove Tubes, is to offer you those choices and not just stand up here and say, buy our soap, this is the only brand we got and it's the best there is, because it really would be a disservice to you. What we've tried to do is learn as much as we can and pass that knowledge on to you so you can make an intelligent, informed choice when changing your power tubes or your preamp tubes. And I hope we've done some of that for you today. We're going to talk about the rating system and how it's meaningful for you in the way you choose your tube for your amplifier. It's the most common question we get. People call me up, what tubes do you recommend for my amplifier? And that's a lot like saying, what music do I recommend for your CD player? I honestly don't know what you're looking for, but we are pretty good at describing the differences between tubes. For instance, in our rating system, a number 1 tube or a number 10 tube is as polarized as you can get. Number 1 tubes being tubes that as you play start to distort a lot earlier. There's more ranges of, more rainbow of colors of distortion. They probably at the end of the day have about the same power. They might be 18-watt tubes where a number 10 might be a 20 or a 22-watt tube. Again, remember, that's not meaningful because you can't hear differences in power. You hear more differences in how it translates into that tone characteristic, which is more of a distortion measurement than a power measurement. But a set of number 1 tubes will essentially make your amp start to get a little juicier, a little friendlier, a little bluesier early. If you're a lead player and you have a 100-watt Marshall and a band with a rhythm player who has a 50-watt Marshall, you have the exact perfect case for a rating system. The 50-watt guy wants to play fairly loud and clean and tight and have dynamics. The 50-watt player ought to be using a higher number set of tubes, at least medium to high. And the lead player in that 100-watt amp, which is going to have a volume issue before they get the amp up loud enough to start getting greasy. So what we can do there, well, there's a couple things you can do. The first, I would recommend pick a lower number set of tubes because that'll help alleviate the problem of playing with a too loud of an amplifier. Another sidebar, you can remove 2 amps from a 100-watt Marshall and make it a 50-watt Marshall. You just have to be careful because you've changed the impedance and the output transformer is no longer looking at 4 EL34s, it's looking at 2. So you have to take that output transformer on your Marshall and move it down a notch. If you've got it set up for 8 ohms, take it down to 4. and that will match the impedance from two AL34s where you used to have 4 to go to your 8 ohm or 16 ohm speaker cabinet. That's just a sidebar. But in choosing the type of tube, we usually recommend go something in the middle. A 5 would be, of course, in the middle, but our middle range is 4, 5, 6, and 7. That's what we call pretty much the normal performance for that tube. And the vast majority, about 70% of the tubes that we'll measure in this system, will probably wind up in this 4 to 7 range. Produces most sets of tubes. And that's a safe bet. That's pretty much what the amp was designed to sound like and work like. If you're happy with your amp, the power level that you're playing at, I say stay in the middle. If you, however, want a cleaner sound, you're playing bass, you're playing, like a rhythm guitar, or you're using it for acoustic electric and you want clarity, I think you're very safe going to an 8, 9, or 10, what we call our high range. And in the Fender line of tubes, those are called red colors. The red scale, Fender is blue for the low, white for that middle range here, 4 to 5, and red for the 8, 9, and 10 if you select a set of groove tube Fender tubes for your Fender amp. But in our regular system, it's a 1 to 10 scale. So again, 50 watt amp to be clearer, brighter, cleaner, go for a medium to high number. 100 watt amp, you want to get a little juice out of it and make it, for the smaller club or in a studio recording environment, you want to get it a little juicier, get more flavors of distortion. Then a lower number. And now here's the beauty of it. Remember I talked about biasing your amplifier. Every amplifier needs a bias adjustment. The easiest way to understand a bias adjustment is it's like a carburetor adjustment on an engine. Knowing what gas you're running the carburetor, the kind of spark you're getting, a mechanic can idle adjust your engine so when you're sitting at the stoplight, you're not burning too much gas and you're not going to lug it. If your idle is set too low, much like your bias is set too high, essentially it's going to take too much pedal to get you off in other words, you can't get a reaction from the engine because you're basically idling so low that it stalls out when you step on the gas. If you're idling too high, you got to keep your brake on the stoplight and you're burning up gas. That would be like an under-biased amp. Basically means we don't have enough bias voltage, so the electrons are flowing and you're wasting your gas. That tube is dying while you're under biased. If you're over biased, it's running too cold and it takes too much guitar signal coming in to open that grid up and let that. So there's a beautiful bias point in that middle. It'll usually be a small range, and any technician can bias your amplifier. It should be done every time you change tubes, unless, and here's the punchline, you're using a groove tubes of the same type and the same rating number. Then it's much like setting your guitar up, and this is another good example. If you have extra super slinky strings on a guitar, you might want to take some neck tension off with your neck adjustment so that the neck is straight with that very low amount of pressure. If you put a heavy gauge set of strings, you start warping your neck, you tighten up your string adjustment and straighten your neck out again. So you adjust the tension of your neck for the spring of this, or the tension, let's say, of the string that's on your guitar. Much the same way, if you were to change from a 6L6 GE tube, which we make here, to a 6L6, let's say, Russian tube, these could have different bias characteristics in the same amplifier. So every time you change a type of tube, or if you want to go from a number 10 to a number 1, you just want to change radically your amplifier, these are going to be conditions where you're going to have to readjust your bias setting on the amplifier. Again, very, very easy thing for a technician to do. It's 101 tube amp tuning, and they adjust the bias voltage. But here's the beauty of this, is if you want to go on the road and take an extra set of tubes and you've got GE 6L6's number 5 and you take an extra set of tubes, in fact it could be a 6 or a 4, something within a close tolerance of that number 5, 1 or 2 points, you can plug them in without any rebiasing on the road. If you've used the tubes for on an average of a year or a year and a half and they're starting to sound like worn out tubes, and they will, much like worn out strings, you can it's a gradual thing. But you can just replace those tubes with our system and go out and buy yourself another 6L6 GE in a 4, 5, or 6 rating within a couple points of that number you have in there. Plug them in yourself, no biasing. You only have to do that one time. And that's another feature of groove tubes where we try to quantify what it is that's going on with the tubes for you, in a musical sense, as a musician, it's just like going out and buying the same Ernie Ball super slinky strings that you've always bought. You know you can change them without having to reset up your guitar and retension your neck and readjust your bridge. We wanted to make that as easy for changing tubes, because at the end of the day, these are user serviceable parts. You should be able to plug those in yourself. Preamp tubes are self-biasing. We'll talk about the preamp section later. This is the power section. Power tubes need to be biased. Buy a set of groove tubes of the same type and the same rating number. You don't have to rebias them. It's something you can repeat easily.